So today we discuss the essay called "The Left, Old and New," and I think that's very important because we see a revival of the left, or of what people perceive as the left. We see violence in the streets, we see intimidation at the universities and in the public sphere, and many people, including objectivists with whom I disagree, consider that this is a revival of Marxism. Now, I think it's a big question whether the new left or the left. So there are two questions. First, is the left that we see today an organic continuation of the new left? And the second question is the new left an organic continuation of the old left and of Marx? The answer I give is that they're both bad, but I don't think it's the same phenomenon. So today we're going to discuss what is the answer that Ayn Rand gives in this essay. So as we've done with all the previous discussions of essays, we're going to go through it. I'm going to throw the ball quite often to Andy, and Andy will comment on the material. So I've chosen some parts that I consider highlights, and we'll discuss them with Andy. You can, anyone wants, they can jump in after Andy's comments. And as I do quite often, I want to also make a comment about how good Ayn Rand's essays operate as essays. So someone would expect that this is a topic that deals with politics, so she's going to start discussing politics. But actually, she sets quite nicely the stage early on. So she opens this way. She opens discussing a movie that was on TV, and actually a bad movie. And in that movie, the movie portrayed Attila. Now, Attila, the warlord. And Ayn Rand noticed that in the movie, Attila had an astrologer by his side, as his only advisor, as he says. So before Attila would go on a bloody battle, she would consult the astrologer. And the point she wants to make is how brutal force and irrationality go hand in hand. But then someone who would see this would say, well, this is barbarism that belongs to a different age. This is barbarism that is now long gone. And then Rand says, would you find it amusing if you saw the same Attila balancing a nuclear bomb in the palm of his hand and consulting the astrologer on whether to toss it? Now, this is what sets the stage of the essay, and for many, many pages, there's not a direct reference to the left. It's reference to some articles in the culture, in the popular press, where they deal with, quote, the new spirits of the time. And the new spirit was, well, we try also non-traditional forms of knowledge. We try alternative knowledge, or maybe as today, where they would put it, we decolonize the curriculum, and we see the approach to knowledge of different cultures. So Andy, let's start from here. Let's start from this point. Why does Rand set the stage? Instead of starting talking about the old left was this, the new left is this. Why does he set the stage in this very unusual and unexpected in a way? To be honest, I hadn't read this essay for many years. So I was in page 3, and at some point I had to check, oh, is this the essay about the old left? Because I hadn't realized exactly where she was going with that. So a comment on that.
Well, I mean, I think Ayn Rand starting by several things, showing the impact in popular culture. This was an essay in Time magazine, right? I think it was December 1960, maybe. Now, Time magazine, as she says, is a respected publication. It's read, not just by leftists, but it's read by mainstream intellectuals and educated people. So she's showing a phenomenon in popular culture. And then secondly, I think what sets the scene for her distinction between the old left and the new left is showing the mysticism that's becoming prevalent in the culture, the fascination, even the worship of astrology, nature worship, which holds that human beings are defiling trespassers on nature. She mentions numerology. She's showing that this is becoming a popular trend in the culture, and this lays the groundwork for her, I think, to contrast the new left with the claims to rationality and scientific socialism of the old left. So I think for both those reasons, she starts with this this essay in Popular Culture in Time magazine.
And here's another part of that Time magazine. So the Time magazine says, quote, "The cultural revolution of the 1960s that emphasized Dionysian rather than Apollonian virtues, and it will continue into the 70s." So Ayn Rand has this very famous essay on Apollo and Dionysus, which is in my favorite Ayn Rand essay. And actually, this is a trend that is also captured from Time magazine. And I would say that in a way, this Time magazine article is quite good. Quite good in terms of being prophetic, because at some point, the article says, quote, "It may be that the early 70s will see a period of repressive reaction against the Dionysian tendencies of the young." But then it goes on to say that there is a good chance that what we will see is a revival of religion, either in the terms of a fundamentalism, which is supposedly a reaction to the irrationality of the new left, but also we will see alternative forms of knowledge and alternative modes of, quote, spirituality. So do you think, and that's a hypothesis that I think was ratified, that actually what we see is that not only left-wing mysticism rises up as a reaction to the 1960s irrationality, but also right-wing mysticism. So remember, within the decade after the 60s, we have the forming of the bloc that was Christian evangelists. And many people who don't know the story actually might be surprised to know that this was not a bloc that used to be related to the Republican Party. This was something very new. So Christian fundamentalists going hand in hand with the GOP was in a way a reaction to this 1960s irrationality. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Nikos, and the Time magazine essay is prophetic in that regard. First of all, the nature worship of the environmentalist on the left is a form of religion, and that's specifically what the Time magazine essay references. But then your point is a good one, because this was Ayn Rand's writing in, like, I think in February 1970. And this is the era in which the rise of the moral majority, Jerry Falwell's religious organization, and Ronald Reagan rises to prominence in the Republican Party in this era, and of course wins the presidency in 1980. And so you're right on both counts. And the Time magazine article is prophetic on both counts. The nature worship, is a quasi-religious movement amongst the environmentalists on the left, and the rise of the moral majority and evangelical Christianity supporting the Republican Party, especially Reagan and his successors on the political right. So the rise of religion here in the 1970s is accurate. Times prophesying that accurately, and I think Ayn Rand's in agreement with what that Time magazine article is claiming is going to happen.
So, and as we go on then in the article, by the way, Razi, I can also check the comments. So if you can check the comments, that would be good. So Rand starts by making a good observation, which is that at the center of the new left is this environmental concern. And we discussed last week the antitrust revolution. And she makes an interesting point. She makes the point that what actually the left does is moving the goalposts. So she says that the original argument by the old left was that capitalism would leave everyone poor. Then she brings up the issue of the nuclear bomb. And again, for people to give some historical context, a big part in the left around the 50s and the 60s was the opposition to the nuclear bomb, was the argument for nuclear disarmament. And actually, Soviet Union was also big on that. And Ayn Rand is ferociously against it. So she says, basically, this is an argument that we should capitulate without even a fight. So before we even go on to the next point, Andy, can you tell us a bit why Rand was so fiercely against the movement for nuclear disarmament, and why she considered it a treason and a capitulation to the Soviet bloc?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Soviet Union was essentially the variation on a theme with Nazi Germany. Is a brutal dictatorship that was bent on world domination, imposing a totalitarian state on the world, and would use nuclear blackmail or any other means to attain it. And Ayn Rand was very well aware that, one, in the West, in the semi-capitalist West, our economy was vastly stronger than theirs, and two, our technological advance was vastly greater than theirs, and three, therefore, we could be vastly stronger than them militarily and not be in any weak position where the Soviets could intimidate us into surrender. We could be vastly stronger than them and tell them to go kiss off if they try to intimidate us. And the Soviets were well aware that if they attacked us with nuclear weapons, that an American counterstrike would devastate them. In fact, Khrushchev's biography says that Castro so hated America and so hated capitalism that he was willing to launch offensive weapons against the United States. And Khrushchev, of course, depicted himself as a hero, but but this part is accurate. That he said, "Are you crazy? Do you realize an American counterstrike, first of all, would blow Cuba off the face of the earth, and it would devastate the Soviet Union? So there's no reason for a free country that's vastly stronger, technologically, scientifically, economically, and militarily, to surrender to a totalitarian state, and every reason to build up our military so that they're scared of us. That we're not scared of them; they're scared of us." So I mean, Ayn Rand is absolutely right about that.
And actually, for people who might consider, well, was the communist bloc serious about their use of nuclear weapons? Specifically Mao, and specifically China. So at some point, specifically after 1956, so at the time in the years leading to that article, Soviet Union was a bit less, had a bit less, let's say, revolutionary zeal to expand the revolution abroad. But actually Mao and Mao's China, they had the theory that communist China could prevail even in a nuclear war with the United States. So the argument was, look, both of countries are going to be destroyed, but because there are more people, but actually because of our ideology and because of our spirit of sacrifice, even if both camps, the socialist camp and the capitalist camp, are destroyed, we are going to more quickly, let's say, prevail. So we have to realize that, at least with China, the idea of going on a nuclear war with the United States was somewhere at the back of the heads. It wasn't a complete impossibility. So, and
right.
Also there's the theory that the reason why Soviet Union would be happy with denuclearization is because they had such an advantage on how to call it, like on numbers of troops. They would very easily take over Western Europe. They would very easily, it would be possible that they would very easily take over at least West Berlin and then West Germany, and then the field would be open for their forces. So again, that wasn't completely a scientific fiction scenario. That was a reality. So yes,
a couple of points come to mind with what you're saying, Nikos. Now, I'm old enough to remember the 1960s. That Mao was such a lunatic and such a mass murderer that there was a proper fear of what China might do, and there were any number of serious commentators, conservatives, liberals, across the aisle, as they say, who theorized it was possible that China was becoming so dangerous that the United States and the Soviet Union might have to be allied, in a defense pact against the aggressiveness of China. And speaking to what you said, because I can remember Mao saying, this is a family show, I can't use Mao's terminology, but he did say why he thought China would prevail in nuclear war, even though it would be devastating. He said the Chinese people would get busy having sexual activities, let's put it that way. Well, he dropped the F-bomb there. The Chinese people would get busy having sexual activities, and the population lost would soon be, would be revitalized. Which, by the way, is a good communist point, is that individuals don't matter. It's only the collective that matters. So we lose 500 million people. We'll just get 500 million more to replace them, right? They're just interchangeable parts. But yeah, Mao was an extremely irrational dictator. They didn't have the kind of firepower back then to reach the United States. They might have done serious damage to the Soviet Union, but weapon systems are a secondary issue in making somebody dangerous. Ideology is what makes somebody dangerous. Intent to kill you, conquer you, and murder you is what makes somebody dangerous. They could develop weapon systems as they go along, but the intent is what makes somebody primarily dangerous. And Mao definitely had that intent. So he was a scary dictator. And Ayn Rand, right, again, all the more reason for the United States to use its economic, technological, scientific advantage to build up its military so that it could squash any such enemy.
Definitely. So let's go then on to the transition that Ayn Rand sees. So, but even within the anti-nuclear movement, we're still within the territory of the old left, which is the argument that there is this other system, socialism, which is going to be more productive and it's going to deliver the goods. And there is this theory, this scientific theory, which was Marxist. So I will read a quote from the book, one paragraph, because it's very, very important. And there's no way I can paraphrase it better than Rand. Quote, "The old left had spent years of effort, tons of prints, billions of dollars, and rivers of blood to maintain an Apollonian mask. Old-line Marxists claimed that they were champions of reason, that socialism or communism was a scientific social system, that an advanced technology could not function in a capitalist society, but required a scientifically planned and organized human community to bring its maximum benefits to every man in the form of material comforts and a higher standard of living." And then she says how they predicted that technology would surpass the United States. And actually, let me make a point here. This was also believed by many people in the West. So specifically, economists were favorable to central planning. They would say that, yes, because the socialist system is rationally planned, it will prevail. And one comment before I give a pass to Andy about this scientific element. Remember how Marx differentiated himself from the other leftist of his time, the other revolution of his time. He called his theory scientific socialism, and he opposed it to utopian socialism. So Marx said, this is not about feelings, this is not about the utopia, we're gonna do some serious work. And serious Marxists, specifically in the 60s and the 70s, specifically the Althusser school and all these people, they would read Marxism as they would read science. And that was also the case with the Marxist circles that I was involved in my youth. We would took it as seriously as we would took a science. Because the idea was this is the closest thing that can get to a scientific understanding of society. And Rand understands this. And now compare this to the people today shouting and throwing tantrums in the streets, and these people who say that there is no such thing as a language. So, Andy, do we give a pass to old Marxists that at least they took this seriously? Or is it that because of the grave mistakes of their theory, actually this is, there's not even a point on trying to figure out whether there was something positive in terms of an effort to understand the world?
Evil evil ideas, if left unchecked and unchanged, get worse and worse. You know, this is the sick new left, and its endless violence and rioting is a natural devolution of Marxism. I mean, what's the essence of Marxism? It's class struggle, right? It's built into the very nature of reality. That it's into the very nature of the social world. That the rich get rich by exploiting the poor, and the poor have to rise up to overthrow their oppressors, and murder, you know, millions and millions of members of the owning class. It's built into the very nature of Marxist philosophy. And they did it. They've done it already. I mean, in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cambodia, and they've already murdered, by conservative estimate, according to the Black Book of Communism, 100 million, you know, innocent civilians. Many more, according to Rudolf Rummel in his book, Death by Government. So, you know, they're mass murderers. Their claim to any science or reason is a mirage, and it's an illusion. And Ayn Rand is the best at pointing out that, you know, the myth that socialism would outproduce capitalism was devastated by after World War II. It was very clear that the Soviets and any communist country would never even approximate the production of capitalism. And so the leftists had to give up any claim to productivity and prosperity and benefiting human life on earth. They had to give that up, and they did. They then claimed that capitalism. They didn't claim anymore that capitalism won't produce the goods and socialism will outproduce it. They claimed that capitalism destroys the environment, and that material comfort is not an ideal. So they had to give up the illusion that socialism would produce the goods, and they did. But they're still, something, Nikos, I think you said it before, like weeks ago, and I agree with you. Marxism is ultimately a nihilistic ideology. It always was. It's about envy. It's about this. The people who gain great success under capitalism are generally the most talented and the most hardworking. These are the people the Marxists want to kill. They want to kill them and their whole families. It's an envy-ridden hatred of the good for being the good. It's ultimately nihilistic, and the mask is dropping. The mask is dropping. You see them burning down American cities. It's like an Atlas Shrugged. They don't care if they're going to starve next month or 6 months from now, as long as they could kill the good, as long as they can destroy capitalism, as long as they can destroy America, as long as they could destroy, the successful, hardworking, prosperous, happy people, as long as they can kill them, they'll just like Jim Taggart with John Galt. It's not of great concern to him that he'll die himself a few months later. Marxism was always a nihilistic philosophy, envy-ridden to destroy the good for being the good, and the mask has necessarily dropped. And now it's. Could you imagine what Ayn Rand would say today about these riots in the United States and about the unwillingness of Democratic mayors and governors to squash it as they probably should? I think Ayn Rand would have a lot to say about. I'm going to have something to say about this on Monday, because this is my whole case against the Democrats.
So, and this is a prelude to the Monday discussion, but more on that by Razi at the end. I'm not so sure I agree, because, again, this would mean that there is almost an organic link that goes back to Marxism and this movement. But I think with Marxism, at least there was this mask, and this mask actually captured a lot of people. So you would see many societies where some of the very good artists, engineers, very productive people were for the Communist parties because they saw them as the resistance to the Nazis, and then as the people who would use reason to build a society. So specifically in the late 40s, 50s, this idea is still there. Now, as Ayn Rand says, which is the next point I want to mention, after World War II, this collapses. And as he says, quote, "The promises of socialist abundance are not very convincing in a world where most of the working youth worship American products and gadgets and would swim the ocean if they could to come to America." So now we start moving towards the new left. And so today we see the spectacle of old Marxists blessing, aiding, and abetting the young hoodlums who are their products and heirs, who proclaim the superiority of feelings over reason, of faith over knowledge, of leisure over production, of spiritual concerns over material comforts, of primitive nature over technology, of astrology over science, of drugs over consciousness. Now, let me concretize this a bit. So Ayn Rand discusses the New Left, but let me take 1 minute to give you a passage by one of the leaders of the New Left, Jerry Rubin. So here's how Jerry Rubin describes his life once he withdrew from protesting. Because what you'll see with the New Left and many new social movements is they go on a protest very passionately with their emotions, but they haven't got any agenda, so the protest kind of burns itself, and then they retreat to something else, and then they come back to a different process. So listen how Rubin describes himself. So he says, quote, "In 5 years, from 1971 to 1975, I directly experienced est, gestalt therapy, bioenergetics, rolfing, massage, jogging, health food, tai chi, SLN, hypnotism, modern dance, meditation, Silva mind control, Arika, acupuncture, sex therapy, right hand therapy, and many other things that I don't even know what they mean." And then he says, "What was the point of all this? I learned to love myself enough so that I do not need another one to make me happy." Now, what I get from this is that the world out there makes no sense. I've given up on my main tool of how to make sense of the world, which is my mind, and I need to find something to change my life and find meaning. And that, I think, was the archetype of the New Left. Experience with everything, which is away from reason and away from what we would call enlightenment and modernity and objective knowledge.
Was there a question there, Nikos?
No, it was a statement requiring your commentary, if you have one.
Oh, yeah. I going back to what you said before. Like you said, it was for the old left. Rationality was a mask. It was a veneer. It wasn't their reality. So it was more civilized in its. I'm gonna take that back. It wasn't civilized. The philosophy put into action by the Bolsheviks and their successors was mass murder. They're murderers. They're always murderers. They're principled mass murderers. So unlike the Americans, whose principle of individual rights, and then Americans violated it any number of times. For instance, slavery and Jim Crow, both. So the Americans were hypocrites in that regard. Some Americans were hypocrites, as we need to condemn them for that. But their principles were right. The Americans committed these atrocities when they violated their own principles. The communists, like their ideological siblings, the National Socialists, they're principled mass murderers. The more they put into practice their class war or race war principles, the more murder they commit. Their principles are evil and of brute force. The commitment to rationality, scientific socialism, and the Marxists is a lie. It's a veneer. It's a chimera. And now the mask is dropped. And now the nihilism is out in the open. So I think there's a direct continuation of this Marxist philosophy. Marxism is a philosophy of, for, and by envy-ridden wannabe mass murderers. That's the essence of Marxism. Let me repeat that. It's a philosophy of, for, and by envy-ridden wannabe mass murderers. And it's always been that way, going back. Marx and Engels didn't hide what they intended to do. They intended to liquidate their class enemies. And the Nazis didn't hide what they intended to do. They intended to, enslave and or annihilate their racial inferiors. So the theory is murderous in both cases and leads directly to mass murder in practice. So the mask had to drop. It was untenable. The essence of the philosophy is mass murder.
Let's go to Bob, who has a comment.
Yeah, I think there has to be a distinction between the leaders and the followers. And I think it's true that from the very start, the leaders were anti-reason. but most of the followers were fooled. Some of them were they were willing dopes, but many of them were legitimately fooled. And I think that has to be taken into consideration when you start talking about the current new left.
Yeah, and that brings me to a very important, to something that I think is important, and I forgot to mention in previous discussion about the old left. It's very interesting to see how many people in the old left were completely devoted, almost in a religious way, but because they thought that this is a system that makes sense in terms of reason. So, for example, they would be, specifically in Greece after the Civil War, people would go and be executed, and they would say, you know, we're going to execute you unless you denounce the Communist Party. They say, no, I'm not denouncing, you can kill me. And if you see like their last letters and stuff, they say, well, it's unavoidable that the world is leading towards socialism, so I'm just paving the way for what is but a historical necessity. But a historical necessity, the way they saw it, a historical necessity based on a blueprint that makes sense. So I tend to agree with Bob. So although you see this religious fervor, at the same time, this religious fervor is linked with an understanding that this is different. We're not dying to go to a better world. We're dying to pave the way for a better world down here on Earth, which is, Rand then is criticizing in Atlas Shrugged. At some point, he says, the religious wants to give up for a better life after death. The communist, he doesn't name them like that, but the materialist wants to give up this world for a better life after 5 generations. So at the end of the day, although there is again this mask of rationality, you scratch under the surface and you find similarities with irrational and mysticist movements.
Nicholas, let me make a quick comment here. I don't know how anybody could be honestly fooled by a philosophy that openly calls for class war and the destruction of the owning class. But let's say that's true. That could only possibly be true until the 1930s, because by the 1930s, the atrocities of Stalin were known to anybody who was paying attention, anybody who was honest, and then communist practice matched communist theory, that they actually did mean class war and the annihilation of the owning class. Then you had that integrated picture of theory and practice, all of which led to mass murder. So by the 1930s, anybody who was duped by communism was evading. That was not, there could not be, by the 1930s, that could not be an honest follower of communism, unless they're completely ignorant. If like you're a 15-year-old high school kid, maybe, and all you know about Marxism is that it claims to stand up for the little guy and the workers and to end oppression. You don't know anything else about communist theory or communist practice. Maybe then, you know, you could be an honest dupe, but not anybody who's educated and knows the truth about the full truth about the theory and the practice. No, by the 1930s, there were no more honest communists.
So let me tell you how I was an honest communist. So, you know, there's this saying that history is written by the winners. So at least in Greece, the argument was that most of the stuff that you hear about Soviet Union was a lie. And they had very good ways to portray this as a lie. So they said, for example, well, this historian was wrong on that one, therefore he's also wrong on that one. Or they had a good criticism of Solzhenitsyn, that Solzhenitsyn, for example, is not a person who is to be taken seriously because of this and this and this. Therefore, whatever he's writing in the Archipelago is not to be taken seriously. I have to say here, I'm not one of those people today who is a big fan of Solzhenitsyn. And Ron was also not a fan of Solzhenitsyn for another reason. So if you want to believe something, and I agree with you, it is an evasion. But if you want to believe something, it is possible, specifically if there's a mechanism of people who for generations have this quote ideal as their highest value and have created a whole of kind of alternative history, so to speak. But I have met many people who were honest, who were honestly mistaken about what they believe about Soviet Union and even about Stalin. So it happens, and because it has happened to me, I have a first-hand experience. Now, again, I was evading, but I wasn't even 100% sure I was evading. So the online Marxist, says Rand, used to claim that a single modern factory could produce enough shoes to provide for the whole population of the world, and that nothing but capitalism prevented it. When they discovered that facts of reality involved, they declared that going barefoot is superior to wearing shoes. And I think this is what captures the essence of the new left. And as he says in later, they do not seek to take over industrial plants. They seek to destroy technology. And this is what we see nowadays, I think, with the left. It has reached the point where it is openly attacking industrial society with the tool of environmentalism. So let's take the last word from Andy, and then I'll go to the audience where I see two hands.
Right, and I think Ayn Rand's example is brilliant. When they realized that socialism or communism could not produce shoes, they changed their mantra to going barefoot is better. It shows that they never cared about human life. They never cared about prosperity. That was all a lie, and they had to drop the lie that they were capable of producing the goods. I mean, this really shows us the philosophy was always about dictatorship. It was always about authoritarianism. It was always about destroying capitalism. And ultimately, it's always been about mass murder. It's about annihilating the owning class, the best. Again, remember, under a dictatorship of some kind, Nikos, the monarchy or the aristocracy, whatever it is, the theocracy, the people who rise to the top are the dictators and his flunkies and his cronies. But under true capitalism, that existed for a while in the 19th century, the people who rise to the top are the most talented, hardworking people, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, people like that. Immigrants who come in and work hard. Maybe they don't become multimillionaires, but they start their own business and they have prosperity. Those are the people who rise to the top. These are the very people the communists intend to kill and always intended to kill and kill their whole families. So, it's always been a mass murdering, class destroying, class warfare philosophy, and the veneer of socialism, the veneer of caring about prosperity and human life on earth has openly dropped, and the nihilism is now out in the open. I'll just put it this way. In the United States today, in some of the American cities where the rioting's going on, and just going on and on and on, the barbarians are not at the gates because they're inside the city. They're burning it down. And that's what they want. Their destruction for its own sake. That's who they are. And I think it's very clear today.
Yeah, one last question, a 5 seconds answer. What have these people got to do with Marxism? I bet these people haven't read a word of Marx in their life. So why are we calling them Marxists or communists?
Because I think they want to destroy capitalism. They want to kill the rich. They want to murder the owning class. They believe in class war, and not only class war now, but that's the Marxist element. But they've added a National Socialist element now. They've added race war elements to it. It's not just the rich exploiting the poor anymore. Now it's the rich white people exploiting the poor non-whites. And I feared race war for a long time. And the left, the Marxist left, which now has incorporated National Socialist elements, they're pushing us towards class war, race war, civil war. They're Marxist in the sense that in part they're fighting class war. But the ultimate goal also is destruction of the owning class, destruction of capitalism, destruction of the economy, and then mass murder, mass starvation. That's what Marxism always intended. There was a veneer, there was a mask of scientific socialism that would produce, but it's impossible for it to produce. And when they realized it was impossible for it to produce, if they were honest, they would have said, we were wrong. We care about human life. We always did. So we endorse capitalism. But they didn't take that track, did they?
Yeah, but someone can't be a horrible person without being a Marxist. So
yeah, there are Nazis. There are all kinds of horrible persons. Nazis, jihadists.
Yeah, and specifically because language matters, that's why I'm very uncomfortable in calling them Marxist, because they have some of the characteristics that you said, but they're not Marxist. They don't have a Marxist critique of capitalism. They don't believe in the Marxist theory of revolution. They might have a different theory of revolution, but it's not the Marxist one. So that's why
All right, I get your point. We could agree to disagree on this, Nikos. I think the class war philosophy, the class war ideology is there. The hatred of capitalism is there. The hatred of the owning class is there. I think this is Marx's legacy. Although you're right, Antifa, you know, for example, they never read Marx. I'm not even sure these guys can read, you know, but they've absorbed, you know, by a cultural osmosis, some of Marx's ideas, and they support it, and they support it violently.
exactly.
You know.
And this is the last part of the essay, but we have to let Andy go, and then we'll see how the left wins by default. But before that,
I got to go teach those bright young minds, guys. It's been a pleasure. I'll see you on Monday.
thank you, sir. See you Monday.
Everybody, okay. Bye, adios.
Adios. So let's go to Alejandro, and then we go to Bob, and then we cover one more thing that I want from the essay, and then we see what happens. Yeah, Alejandro.
First, I don't want to have any issue with you because you're a very nice guy. But I wonder how come you didn't see how the kind of genocide communists are. When I was young, I recalled what was going on with Cuba, and then I learned about what the killing fields in Cambodia, or the denouncement of Khrushchev on the genocide by Stalin. How can you not see that? And how come people in your Greek environment didn't see that? Even your own parents. It was so obvious.
That's a good question. Yeah, I have an answer, but the question is good. I accept the moral blame, because it is a moral blame at the end of the day. So at some point, what I ended up is basically an apologist for these crimes. But again, here's the context. The context is you grow up in a society where the archetypical figure of the communist is the hero who is in the mountains fighting the Nazis, the guy who was persecuted for decades, and basically your family members that you know that were exiled in socialist countries after the Civil War. So this already gives you a sense of life, so to speak. And then you read, let's say, the official leftist history or some leftist history that says, actually, if you check the files of the KGB, the people who were persecuted under Stalin were not 15 million, there were actually 800,000. And here are the official documents. So you say, well, okay. And also, the imperialists lie about all the things. They lied about mass graves, for example, in Kosovo. It was proven that this was a lie. Therefore, this is also a lie. So someone who wants to believe will believe. So how did I justify the genocides? I didn't believe that the genocides happened. How did I justify the Ukrainian famine? Well, this was just an act of nature and had nothing to do with Stalin, because here is a document from 1932 that Stalin says, for example, make sure that there's enough food for Ukraine. So again, it was an evasion and it was a big mistake, but someone who is within that framework and someone who truly believes that, look, everyone in the culture is telling me that the left wings are the good guys, right? So how is it possible that good guys do bad things? Remember, in Greece and basically everywhere in the world, almost everywhere in the world, 99% of the right-wingers cannot make a moral argument against the left. They will say, well, yeah, you know, your methods are bad, but your ends are good. So I say, okay, if these people's ends are good, well, maybe some people have died, definitely not that many, because here the document that says that this is imperialist propaganda. So even well-meaning people, and I was a well-meaning people, I would never imagine seeing someone being persecuted or tortured or killed. But it's very easy, if you lack the intellectual ammunition, to fall for all that stuff. And again, there was no alternative. There was no other voice that told me, you know what? The left is wrong on their ends, not only on their means. And when you realize why the ends are bad, then it's easier to start unfolding and take out the peels from the onion, as we'd say, and see where this is leading. So, yeah, there is no excuse, but there's an explanation. So, but no, I get your point. I think it's something that should be it's something that I'm definitely not proud of, and something that but I can also understand how so many people, let's say, fell for it, and how not everyone who felt for it was, let's say, a bad person. Specifically, based on the historical context. Let's say if you're in Cambodia in the 80s and you say, yes, I'm a communist, something's really wrong. But within the historical context of Greece, with all the baggage of the civil war, the dictatorship, the persecutions of the left, it was way easier to create this image that these are the good guys and they're actually persecuted by the imperialists.
Can I just say quickly before we go to Alejandro for a follow-up and then to Bob, that especially for the London people here, I have now confirmation that on Wednesday, the 16th of September, we're back at the Crosswall and we're booked basically for every Wednesday from then onwards. So I will post about this and I will announce it, and I encourage everybody from now to, at least for the 16th of September, reserve that evening so we can have a nice, impressive comeback. Alejandro.
And something else, I think that Rand was brilliant in exposing the new tactics the communists pursued in the 1960s and 70s, ecologism, peaceful peace protest, or the peace movement, which was very well grounded in Britain. And I think that there should be historical research on how the Soviets financed these movements in the UK.
Yeah,
but I think that
for the nuclear disarmament, there was a time that I think was one of the biggest groups, one of the biggest social movements actually in the world. So yeah, that's a good point. If you want references, bibliographical references about that, I've done research about this in the past, so we can discuss it at some point.
But I think that these guys, the new left guys, are grounded on German Romanticism rather than Marxism, because if you see the timeline goes just from there.
And I agree with you and I believe there's a breach basically between Marxism and the new left. I mean, maybe not philosophically, but in terms of, let's say, for the political scientists, there is definitely a breach, because there's so many things that are different that it begs the question why they should be put in the same category. And again, all this is in the book. Unfortunately, it's with an academic publisher, so it's expensive, but you can order it to your local library or something. And if Razi would be kind enough to put the link in the chat room, that would be good. But again, I was reading it when I was very new in the objectivist movement, so by no means should this be considered, let's say, even an objectivist influence work. But thanks for the comment, Alejandro. This point with the German Romanticism, I think, is really spot on. Bob.
I think it's that believing everybody who fell for communism is like believing everybody who ever owned a slave was in favor of slavery. Is that intelligible?
It is, but the question is, how should we judge then these people? Context.
What did they know? What field were they in? Were they intellectual? What evidence did they have at their disposal? Now, to what in fact were they evading? And why were they evading? And how massive was that evasion? So Jefferson in slavery, for example, didn't look like he was evading, but he was caught. He didn't know what he could do. You in Marxism, for example, how your evasion was sort of minor. Push that to the side because these are the facts that are really important right now. Anyway, that was one of the points I wanted to make.
No, it's a, and there was a book, I don't remember by whom, but the title was something like, there was this former Marxist historian who he wrote either an article or a book but the title was something like, when did you know and what did you know? So it was like an open letter to his fellow Marxists, asking them, okay, here's an important question. What exactly did you know about the crimes of Soviet Union, and when did you know it? And what did you do about that? And yeah, if you ask me, there was a time when I realized that I knew too much, and now it was like an evasion. Anyway.
That brings me to my second point.
Yes.
Think of the people who, in fact, saw something wrong with communism and where they went. You went one way. What direction did Whittaker Chambers go? Are you familiar with that?
Is he the guy who wrote the review of Atlas Shrugged?
Yes, for National Review. He's the one who said, I knew there was a God when I looked at my child's ear. There are other people turning away from the left. David Rubin, would you say he's dishonest?
But the thing with these people is they were more like on the superficial level, let's say what we'd call liberal leftists. I would call myself, there was a time where in Facebook you could put your ideology, and I would put Marxist-Leninism. Because again, the point was, if these are the good guys, you have to go for the most principled ones, right? So, and this was, how old was I back then? I was 23, 24, so I wasn't like 15. So, yeah, again, that's not an excuse, but it made me a bit more understanding toward how people can do massive mistakes and not being horrible people. Again, there's a point after which there's no excuse. But anyway, one last thing I want to make before we call it a day. So towards the end, Rand says, any intellectual credibility of the left has gone down the beam. They've basically exposed themselves as being ridiculous in terms of they made a complete U-turn. But what he says, quote, the leftists may still have a chance by default. A society cannot exist for long in an intellectual vacuum. Culturally, we're approaching the stage where anyone can take over, provided his doctrines are sufficiently irrational. A cultural vacuum provides its own variants of fissures in muddy waters, and on such terms, whoever is the muddiest wins. And that's what he says at the end, that the real danger is not that the readers will agree with the irrationality. It's that they will basically say, well, you know, who knows? Turns out you can't think. Turns out you can't figure it out. That's why he says at the end, the first step of the battle is to realize that the enemy is not the screeching Dionysian hippie puppets, but those exponents of middle-of-the-road respectability who tell them gently in their classrooms that words, ideas, and philosophy do not matter and that the Attilas do not mean it. So, and my final question is, what does this tell us about tomorrow? About today. So, what is the default that is winning? And is it the default that is winning? Because now we see real people who are, let's say, missionaries of this nihilism. We're past the time where it was somewhere in the culture, and now we find ourselves with this nihilism and this tribalism being endorsed by big businesses, being endorsed by governments, being endorsed by everyone. So identitarianism is the only game in town. Today, for example, I saw in the UK, there was a proud announcement that a train, which was painted in the LGBT flag colors, will run having a crew which is solely LGBT workers. Now, the thing is, I don't see this as empowering, because what you're telling is that what defines you is this identity, that you are this identity. And again, people very easily can misunderstand. They say, so are you against the LGBT rights people? No, I'm not. And I've been fighting for these rights, and I still do. But I don't see these rights being protected by this tribal atmosphere, right? So everywhere you see, identity and identity politics is the only game in town. And I'm afraid that there's no good ending to that. So I think we've moved past what Rand's essay says, not in a vacuum, but this vacuum now being officially filled by identitarianism, and the results are what we see in the news every day. Any parting words by someone or by Razi?
Yeah, I have parting words. So Monday, we will post this event tomorrow on Meetup, but I'll tell you what it is right now. We have a discussion titled "The U.S. Elections: Who Should Americans Vote Against?" And that's going to be, I was told, not a debate, but a discussion with Bob Stubblefield and Andrew Bernstein. And you can try to guess who's going to argue to vote against whom, or you can join us on Monday and find out. And that's a 1-hour event, right? So it's going to be 7 p.m. UK time. That's 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Athens time, and figure out if you're somewhere else. So
can I say one more point, Razi? I talked about the example of the train, but I forgot where I was going, but now I got. So again, someone could say this is good, but see how this translates, for example, on the issue of racial identity. We read some days ago about universities who want to have black-only corridors or black-only buildings. Like, this is literally segregation. So, and that's the only outcome. So you can see a thing here and there and say, oh yes, that's empowering, that's good. These people who didn't have a voice, now there's the whole train run only by people of this group. But again, take this to its logical conclusions and you see bad things happening. So that's why I think that the situation today is worse than the situation that is described at the essay, although it's only the logical conclusion of what Rand predicted. Anyway, thanks for the contributions, and thanks for the comments. Razi, you deserve to do the parting words.
I already did the parting words.
Yeah, but like the official parting words. Like
Those were official. You just you added something, but okay. Thanks everybody. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Follow us on all the social media, especially LinkedIn, just because that's something we're focusing more on right now. And yeah, see you Monday.
Thanks everyone. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.